That was a great whistle, thank you. I didn't know my mom was here. So thanks for having me, and we're going to talk about some of the trends related to You Lost Me. I think what we'll do is spend, a few minutes talking about some of the trends. I'll do some slides. Researchers use slides best, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll just take some questions. So, I mean, it's a small group, and happy to engage with you as you see fit. We want to talk a little about some of the trends related to millennials, and these are the two books that I worked on related to this age group and some of the challenges that they're experiencing related to the church. unChristian looks at young non-Christians and their perceptions of the church and of evangelicalism. You Lost Me looks at the perceptions of young Christians. And I think this is particularly pertinent in the fact that we know from the research when we ask pastors, what is the toughest age group for you to minister to, we find that the most common response is, look at the data here, people in their 20s, people who are college age, high school, and junior high. It's like sort of this 13 to 30 is a real sort of black hole for a lot of pastors. And I'm going to describe for you in a few minutes why I think that's so particularly important for us to deal with. But so this is a very felt need, I think, for a lot of pastors. And by that I mean this is a very urgent question that a lot of denominations and organizations are trying to deal with. Like, where is the next generation going, and why is it that they don't seem to be so connected to denominationalism, et cetera? Just a little bit of background for the science nerds. I'm trying to, Justin Timberlake has this song, Bringing Sexy Back. I'm bringing nerdy back. And so when you see this slide here, this is for you stat hounds. This is the sample sizes and the sampling error associated with some of the work that went into this. We did something like, $200,000 worth of research just in this single book. And so we're trying to help the church. We invest a lot of our resources and profits into new research. One thing that I'd like to mention to you as we get started, that a lot of the work that we produce is available for free online at barna.org. We also have some new microsites on hispanics.barna.org, as well as cities.barna.org. And so this idea of trying to help the church navigate a changing world, that's really our mission. This is a bit of a side note, but in 1 Chronicles 12:32, when King David becomes king of the entire nation of Israel, remember he's king of just the tribe of Judah for a period of time, he assembles all the various tribes, and they sort of enumerate their number of people and their job responsibilities. The Levites are what? Like the priests. You've got different warrior tribes, and so the tribe of Issachar is described in a very interesting way. Any of you know how it's described? People who what? Say it again. Yeah, people who understood the times and knew what to do. And so we feel like we're a modern day Issachar in some way, trying to help the church understand the times. So knowledge to navigate a changing world. And so you can check out some of the work. The best way to stay in touch with us is through the free email newsletter that we put out a couple times a month. So as we talk about some of the trends, when I went into the research behind You Lost Me, I really assumed that we'd find that a lot of these young people were losing their faith. We even had a question at lunch today from a youth pastor who was saying, you said that 6 out of 10 people lose their faith. And it's like, we have to be very careful, I think, in the language that we use as Christians, because I think at its best, we're very optimistic about what God wants to do with his people, and we're pessimistic about culture. And so you add those two things together, and we sometimes want to say, well, gosh, look at all the young people who are losing their faith, when in fact, that's not really the accurate way of describing it. And so when we went into this, we actually realized there are 3 faith journeys, and there's a real difference between nomads and prodigals. Nomads are individuals who walk away from the church. Prodigals are those who walk away from their faith. And so you can use other language if you want. I mean, you could talk about nomads being individuals who are, sort of culturally Christian. They're sort of backsliders. Prodigals are individuals who are like ex-Christians. They've literally become, like they say, I'm no longer associated with a Christian faith. But you can see it's a lot less common. 1 in 10 young people who grew up in a Christian church are prodigals, and 4 times as likely for someone to be a nomad at 4 in 10. And then we have this third group, and depending on how you measure it, it could be anywhere between 1 in 10 or 2 in 10. I think it could be as large as 3 in 10. Exiles who feel lost somewhere between culture and the church. So when you see this sort of information, right, so this is the faith journeys that the young people take today. One thing I want to mention to you that I think is really important. Prodigals and nomads are faith journeys that happen in any kind of setting with any kind of people in any kind of generation. So you could have prodigals or nomads from, 1,000 years ago, right? A person could literally lose their faith. They could walk away from the institutional church in some way. That's a very classic kind of faith journey that people could have. What I think is unique and important for us to pay attention to is this idea that exiles, think of this, exiles are dependent on the cultural backdrop. Their faith journey relates to the fact that the culture changed significantly behind them. So think about Esther or Daniel or Jeremiah, people in the Old Testament who are exiles. And what happened for them, the reason that they're interesting to us isn't just because they were people of courage or whatever, but because the backdrop of their faith changed pretty dramatically. Does that make sense? In other words, being an exile, I think we're seeing a rise of exiles within today's church because, as you'll see, I'm going to argue in the next few minutes, that we're actually in a more sort of Babylon-like culture of complexity and all the rest. And so this idea of paying attention to the exiles is very important to us. Okay, so that's the way people leave, those three different journeys. The other thing we could talk about is sort of why they leave. So the way they leave, not everyone is all three of those things. One other point I should make about this before I talk about these seven things, that I think, I don't have as much data to support this as I do some of this other stuff that we're going to talk about, but I think this speculation is important. I think that exiles are sort of the gateway drug to becoming a prodigal or a nomad. You start out as an exile, and it's not positive or negative being an exile, it just is. And what happens is these young exiles begin to ask questions about faith and science or sexuality or doubt, and then when the church isn't able to respond in a very effective way, they become a prodigal or a nomad. So exiles aren't bad, but they start their journey that way many times, and then when the church is unable to answer some of these deeper questions, they become further removed from the church. They're less hopeful and optimistic. They're more. You've had these conversations. If you're a parent, you've had these conversations with your kids, and you sit there and you reason with them, and they just sit there and they just blink at you like, huh? And I don't get it. Whatever. Or you've had these conversations with maybe a peer who you're trying to tell them about Jesus, or you're trying to tell them they used to be a Christian, or they're kind of like disengaged for the church, or they're a nomad, and you earnestly pour your heart out and say, man, I really wish you could be a part of this, or I wish that Jesus could come and reach you in your point of need, and they're just sort of like, not so much, and so this idea of them being really hard to resistant really to the gospel. It's like you've maybe heard this analogy before, they've been anesthetized or inoculated to the gospel. So what does inoculation do? You get just enough of the bacteria or virus so you don't hear it anymore. Your body can't be affected by it anymore. And I think that's what's happened in our culture today, is that people have been inoculated to the gospel. We have a nation of spiritual nomads. Think of it this way, friends, and I get a little bit excited. I love numbers. When we ask in our surveys, have you ever made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ that's still important in your life? Guess what percentage of Americans say yes to that? Oh, hold on for that a sec. I'll come back to that. What percentage of Americans say they're Christian? What is it? Okay, I love it. You got really specific then. You're like, well, I don't want to be too specific because the researcher's in the room, What did you say at first? It's okay. 70-something. Oh, so, okay, you did. Okay, I thought you said 72 and then you changed it to 70-something. So 70-something, okay. Other guesses? Percentage of Americans say I'm Christian. No one wants to be wrong, man. I'm not going to, there's no ejection seats. It's cool, man. 63? It's like 82, 81%. Yeah, nice job. There's a door prize at the back of at the end. So 82% of Americans say they're Christian, okay? That means 4 out of 5 Americans say they're Christian when you ask, what is your religious faith? Now, sometimes you think sort of skeptically, well, it's really easy to call yourself a Christian, like those people aren't really Christians. Fair enough. When we ask a question, have you ever made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ that is still important in your life? Guess what percentage of Americans say yes to that? What'd you guess? 50, okay. Who thinks it's lower than 50? Who thinks it's higher than 50? Who wants to wait until I say and then you'll guess, right? It's 69%. 70% of Americans, almost 7 out of 10 Americans say they have made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ is still important in their life. Here's another fascinating thing. We did a survey looking at whether people believe that the resurrection is literally true or if it's just sort of a fable, like a spiritual fable. We actually went through a whole series of questions like Noah's Ark, Samson's hair, the virgin birth, all these different stories. Do you think that were literally true? They literally happened pretty much as described, or are they just sort of some spiritual story meant to illustrate some larger spiritual principle? The story that most Americans were skeptical about was that Samson lost his strength when you cut his hair. Okay, that was the one in which 1/3 of Americans thought that wasn't true. But that means that 2/3 of Americans thought it was true. And 3 out of 4 Americans believe that the resurrection is literally true. I mean, it's sort of mind-boggling to think of this, but I want you let's be sociologists here for a minute. 1 out of every 4 Americans are Catholic. 2 out of every 4 Americans are Protestant in background. Add that up. That's about 3/4 of Americans, right? That's about the percentage of Americans who believe the resurrection is literally true. Millions of these people are inoculated to what it means to really follow Jesus. They're spiritual nomads. And so this is very important for us to pay attention to in terms of these trends. Okay, so now the why of leaving is these 7 reasons, and there are many more, and we've tried to create sort of, it's like a factor analysis where we're looking at the different kinds of responses that you can get and then trying to put them into a kind of a category. But they believe that the church is overprotective. They believe that in relation to sex and sexuality, it's repressive. They believe in relation to peers, you have to choose between your faith and your friends. They think that the church is not a safe place to express your doubts. They think that the church is shallow. They think that the lifestyle you have to be Christian is rigid. And so it's interesting, I was doing an interview on NPR, National Public Radio, and a young 20-something research assistant, I don't know whether she was formerly a Christian or not, but it sounded like she was. She said, I've read your book. She was getting me prepped to do the interview on air on NPR. And she says to me, I read your book and I read all the different reasons that you have for people leaving the church. It seems to me you're saying these Christians are living in a more complicated world. But for them, Christianity does not seem to answer, this is literally her quote, Christianity does not seem to answer the complicated questions in a way that is deep, thoughtful, or challenging. Bam. That is the reason that so many young Christians are facing a challenge of their faith. They don't believe that the gospel is as deep, complex, or thoughtful, or challenging to the way they want to live. Now, let's be really, really clear. The gospel isn't just an excuse for us to live the way we want to, right? I'm not advocating for that at all. But it's I think very telling for us that for these young people, it's almost like being Christian means turning off your brain. It means not being fully who you were meant to be. It means being overprotective, repressive, anti-science, exclusive, doubtless, shallow. I mean, you look at the list on the left, and our culture is more complex today than it was 30 years ago in relation to those areas. Culture is more complex. Sexuality is still sex, but it's more complicated with all the media that we consume. Science, peers, the life of the mind, even neurobiology is in the last 2-3 decades gone crazy in terms of helping us think about neuroplasticity, the fact that the brain can actually change. I mean, all these really fascinating things. Life is more complicated, and for us as Christians, we feel to them, to these young Christians who've walked away, almost as though you got to turn off your brain to be a Christian. Okay, so what I want to do for the next 10 minutes is just talk about why this generation is different. If you were in the chapel this morning, you heard me say your generation is different. And I want to give you some examples as to why. So let's start with just straight up social data. The percentage of people who've completed the major life transitions by age 30, this includes having left home, finishing school, being financially independent, getting married, and having a child. You can see the vast majority of Americans 50 years ago had done those things by the time they were 30. So did you ever see the movie Failure to Launch with Matthew McConaughey and Sarah Jessica Parker? All right, this is sort of this idea of being ready to launch in the world. So do you think this has gone up or down? Do you think people are getting through these transitions faster or slower? Quite a bit slower. Fascinating change where today's generation, just 46% of women and 31% of men have completed these major life transitions by age 30. This is incredible social change, friends. Like, this does not happen, during just any old century. This is fascinating change in the way that people think about marriage and getting on in life and sort of what's often called like delayed adolescence or extended adulthood. Let me just quickly say this. When the book has come out about a year ago, the You Lost Me book, year and 3 months, guess what a lot of pastors have said about people dropping out? They're going to come back. Don't worry about that. We've seen this movie before. There's a happy ending at the end. They leave for a while. Don't worry. And moreover, they say often, they're going to come back when what? When they have kids. Guess what? There's just enough truth to that to be dangerous. But what that ignores is what I'm just showing you here. There is a ton of social change happening. And I think what's happening for the typical pastor is that they're thinking about the 60s or whatever, when like life was a little simpler and like, okay, after a few years of just being in college, you get married and you have your kids and then, you're back at your traditional conventional life. But check it out. Most young people today in their 20s are not conventional. They're not following the typical script. And I think what's happening, I mean, Nate, for you and your work, as a pastor, and for all of us, as we're thinking about it, today's 20-somethings are literally a different tribe of people because their social relationships are different. The television show Friends was very prophetic because that is more like what's happening with today's 20-somethings. It's like a group of digital urban tribes who are connected through technology and social media and hanging out, and they date and they undate. And they, I just made up a word there. That's awesome. We'll have to put that on your Facebook page. Undate, like unfriend somebody, you can undate them. You've got all these sorts of ways of connecting, and this is a part of what's different. So today's 20-something, when a pastor, I get literally, excuse this language, but I get really pissed off as a church leader when a pastor says we're going to worry about them when they have kids, Like in the Bible, there is some sort of excuse for targeting the kinds of demographic segments that are convenient for your church to work with. We're just going to worry about the traditional families because we're not really sure what to do with these young single people who, they might be sleeping around, they might not be sleeping around, like they're not big donors, they're not participating in the children's ministries, we can't count on them to show up for certain things. Like, they'll come back when they have kids. Like, that is just the lamest excuse for dealing with social change that I think we could imagine. So I think it's really fascinating that I think a lot of organizations and denominations and local churches are really struggling because they think that if we could just minister to 20-somethings the way we think about them, let's be honest, what kind of young person does the church work better for? A young married couple with kids or a young single professional woman? We know what to do with the married. A lot of our teaching, a lot of our orientation is around, we can help you with your kids. That's why we say this. We'll wait till they have kids because that's basically our customer. And that's just a sorry excuse for how we're dealing with today's 20-somethings. All right, I'm going to skip this and go to, here's another huge shift in the way that our culture is different today than before. Fascinating change to me is that the media immersion is just huge. Again, the 1960s were a profound period of media expansion, but they're nothing like today's world. And my daughter Emily, she likes to watch Cupcake Baker and Cake Boss and those sorts of things. And just think about how this is teaching all of us as consumers. The picture on your right, it's teaching all of us about customization and individual, want things my way. Can you imagine a show about cupcakes in the 1960s on mainstream television. There was less bandwidth for content. And so our whole expectation about this is changing. Or how about the fact that content is moving from passive to interactive and from sort of literacy to visualcy, like our ability to understand things from a visual perspective. My son, Zach, we've been watching some of the Star Wars movies, and it's fascinating watching him experience these films that I saw in the theater for the first time. And remember, in the 1970s, when Star Wars first came out, like we didn't know we'd ever get to see it again. Right? Like it came out in the theater and like there was no such thing as VHS or DVD, and like maybe one Sunday night and your parents would make you go to bed halfway through it. It might be shown on network television. But like the whole idea of access is incredibly different. I mean, we can watch any show anytime at anywhere in the world. It's a fascinating social change, and it's changing the way we think about interaction. So my son, Zach, when we watch these movies, the Star Wars movies, guess what he's more accustomed to understanding in terms of interaction with content? Video games. We've played a lot of Star Wars video games. And so when we watch the movie, his response is, Dad, I know what's gonna happen because we've already beaten this level. We're watching a film and he thinks about it interactively, right? Like that's the way he thinks. Or how about my daughter Emily, when we watch Star Trek episodes, she says to me, we were watching some of the old ones from the 1960s, and she's like, Dad, these are really stupid. What do they do, make these in their garage? And she's like, Kelsey and I could do a better job on our Mac. That's the sort of like the way that this sort of interactive world, she's 13 years old, and she thinks, right or wrong, that she can do a better job than those filmmakers. It's an interactive world. When you think about engaging this generation as a church leader, as a professor, as a peer, as you're talking about your peers, like they want to be engaged. They don't want to just sit back and listen to you. I mean, like this is what we're doing here today is a very anachronistic sort of thing for them, out of time. It won't work for much longer with your peers. It's not that lectures are going away. It's just that we can't just sort of pontificate from the stage for minutes on end. Hours on end. All right, Twitter is an example of this access, this expectation of access. One of my daughter's friends, Kayla, on Instagram, sent a message, did some comment on one of Justin Bieber's pictures, and she asked him a question, and then OMG, Justin Bieber responded to the question. It was like, what color is the backpack? And he's like, purple, whatever. So Kayla's whole world has been turned upside down for a few weeks because it was like, man, she interacted with a celebrity, right? And so this idea of access is very different as well. They're less intimidated by these things. This is why, you watch American Idol auditions, and even though there are moments where they're kind of starstruck, I mean, a lot of millennials, they just walk in there and they're just like, I deserve to be a star. I'm not intimidated by Mariah Carey, they're grateful and they're impressed, but I'm the next Mariah Carey. And this sense of having access and I deserve it, it's part of what is deeply embedded into this generation. And by the way, I think this is really, really important. Remember, I've talked about Babylon, and we're gonna say a little bit more about this in a minute. In Babylon, Daniel isn't starstruck in the presence of Nebuchadnezzar. Access is part of being in Babylon. All of a sudden, you could be found as a next great baker, as an American Idol, as a talented blogger. A young guy who's 20, who's a pastor's son in a Foursquare church, actually. And he said, you have no idea what it did to my faith when I was named by the New York Times one of the top fashion experts in America. In Babylon, we need a theology of fame. We need a theology that says, here's what happens when God elevates you. We need a theology that says, maybe you think you're going to be famous, but what happens when you don't turn out to be as famous as you imagine you ought to be? Super important for us. Okay, so here is my best illustration as to why your generation, speaking to you millennials who are in the room today, is different than the previous generation. This epitomizes our cultural change so well. We're living through a profound period of technological change that is affecting every institution that we have. Media, movies, publishing, journalism, politics, the music industry, everything is under assault in the best way and in the worst way. Morality, sexuality, pornography. This is our world. The best devices, the best inventions of humanity, calculators, camcorders, phones, calendars, Polaroids, photo albums, record players, video game players, maps, remote controls, encyclopedias, weather people, Rolodexes, and on and on and on are in our pockets. And this is a profound period. Martin Luther, during the time of the Reformation, called the printing press God's agent of grace, because he recognized that the technology of the time produced the ability to distribute the ideas, to print and to popularize content and ideas. And the printing press was part of the change that allowed for the Catholic Church to lose some of its sort of unmerited sway and influence. And I think in a similar way, the church is sort of at this precipice where all the people that have power are under assault. If you're a so-called expert, if you're the New York Times or you're CNN or you're the president or you're a research organization or you're a pastor, you are no longer the only expert in the world. You can find an instant counterpoint to anything that anyone would say, right? Like more than a third of young people fact check their pastors during a typical week or a typical month or whatever it is, right? It's huge. It's a huge change. And so this is a fascinating time, and we haven't even begun to understand what this is going to look like. Steve Jobs, who obviously ushered in much of this era with Apple, said that the next 100 years is going to be about the integration. If it's been about technology and consumer products, the next 100 years is going to be about genetics and healthcare and technology. Your kids will be picking their kids' genders and their eye colors. And I mean, we're going to be in a fascinating world in the next 100 years. Just think about that. Like, wow. And what will the Christian community say about that? How are we preparing the next generation of geneticists and biologists and all the rest? So to me, this is where the best biblical metaphor for living in complex times comes down to being in Babylon. This is not the first time that believers have had to struggle with this. Learning the language and science of a foreign culture, living as aliens, as Peter writes. We're living in a powerful period of human history, and it's a privilege to do it. I certainly would rather live here in 2013 than 200 years ago with horse-drawn carriages and no plumbing and all. This is an amazing time to be alive. So what do we do with this? I think the central challenge for our generation is being in but not of this immersive culture. So how do we live in but not of? That's the struggle of being in exile. I've got 3 ideas for you in terms of solutions and conclusions, and then we'll take some questions. The first is that in Babylon, we can't try to mass produce disciples. So part of it is a philosophical shift. You can think about some of these changes, that instead of measuring merely attitudes, attendance, conversion, involvement, number of adult helpers and beliefs in our youth ministries, et cetera, we could begin to measure things like their attitudes, the young people's, their attitudes, their apprenticeship into following Jesus, their sense of calling, not just adult helpers, but being real mentors and engaged in the lives of these young people, and not just the beliefs of these young people, but their passion for Scripture. Another idea that I have is that we need a stronger theology of reverse mentoring. Like exiles are very, very important. They're not incidental to what God wants to do in exile. We sort of think about like, how do we help exiles so they won't be exiles anymore? But in fact, they're very, very important. Younger Christians can help point the church toward new practices and approaches to faithfulness. So if these are the kinds of negative perceptions that we have of the church, what if the next generation is really, like someone asked me this at lunch, like, how can we help this next generation, embrace the absolutes of we love them, but we also want them to embrace the absolutes. Well, I said to him, well, what if it's the next generation that's going to help you figure out what those absolutes ought to be? It's not always clear to us that the older generation is always right about everything. Like in Christian circles 100 years ago, the idea of mixed marriages was anathema. And it took a younger generation, it took outsiders, it took non-Christians to advocate for the injustice of that. And so let's be careful let's hold our views with enough humility to say, like, we need the next generation. God needs the younger generation and uses the younger generation to refresh his people. Just look at that last idea of being, like the lifestyle of dexterity. I think Daniel perfectly epitomizes this lifestyle of dexterity in the very best way possible, of being faithful, of having, as I said this morning, the courage to be proximate and the courage to be pure. Let me spend just 2 minutes on this. So here's a great example of the gap in views on sexuality. So I think that what's happening in our culture is there's these two different narratives. There's the traditionalist narrative sexuality, which is that sex is about the rules. You don't talk about sexuality. The end of sexuality is procreation. My dad, as I've mentioned a couple times today, he's a lifelong pastor, and someone had told him that it's really better when like pastors adopt their children, because like she didn't even want to imagine my dad having sexual relations with his wife. Like, it's just nutty, the kinds of things that people believe. So that's the traditionalist view. Individualist is that sex is about me. Express yourself and enjoy it. At the end of sex and sexuality is about gratification, right? This is, if you turn on any television show today, virtually, you'll find that this is the narrative. So we're sort of torn between these two things. The church sometimes errs on the form of being traditionalist, and the culture is certainly individualist. And by the way, I think a lot of youth pastors make the mistake of trying to like play to the individualists among us, and so they talk about like sex as, like wait till you get married and you'll have mind-blowing sex. And when you just like they make it all about like your own selfish gratification rather than about the fact that sex is really this beautifully broken piece of our existence. And I think when you look at the new narrative that we could have, it's something more relational. Sex is about us, about the consequences of the decisions that we make in terms of our sexuality, that we're humble, we're conscious of others, that the end of it is a certain sort of interdependence, that our sexual choices, for instance, and then becoming pregnant create consequences for the parents and the grandparents and the whole tribe. It takes a village for us to raise young people. Now, when you look at those sort of comparisons, and you can maybe see in the background, you can see sort of the traditionalists and individualists sort of like fading to the back. Who do you think it is that's going to help us bring this relational ethic to the front? Primarily the boomers and elders, or the millennials who are in fact in relationship with this sort of sexually active generation? What's that? I think so. And I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I mean, I had this great conversation with a guy who's a great boomer leader. I'm not trying to critique the boomers, but he had this big funding to do like a dating courtship campaign at a college campus. And I said, how are you engaging millennials in this? And he's like, well, they're the target. And I was like, but do you have any like millennial advisors? Because after all, they ought to be communicating to their peers. I'm sure you'll find other millennials on your Christian college campus who are going to be concerned about sexual ethics. How are you engaging them? And there's like this long silence. And that's the hubris, I think, that we often have as an older generation, that we know best how to help you. And the gospel at its best is the body of Christ saying, you young people, you millennials are on mission to your peers. We as an older generation aren't like irrelevant, but we're not the ones who can help you figure out the relational ethic that the church needs to have in our day and age. I mean, we can help you think about that, but you're the ones who have to sort of work that out. Third idea is this last one, of this idea of vocation and reconnecting faith and work. We know from research that 54% of today's millennials are interested in starting or have already started their own business. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us to recast a vision of vocation that is about faith and work, but also faithfulness in life's complexities. And it's kind of heartbreaking, but check this out. This is the bottom percentage, only 16% of young people who grew up in a Christian home in a church said that they learned how the Bible applies to their field of interest or career. That's just heartbreaking. That's just like, how is that possible? That we have such a a finite understanding of vocation, that's just, we can do better, and we must. Final thought, we need young prodigals, nomads, and exiles more than they need us. That is the bottom line to a lot of our work. The Assemblies of God, Evangel, other institutions will exist in one way or another, let's say in 10 years from now, but the intentional choices that we make to involve the next generation, and it's not just because of the cliche, like they're the future, like we are the world, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Like they are going to dictate and create a vision of what it means to be the church because the Holy Spirit is speaking to them. Think about the story in 1 Samuel 3 where Eli and Samuel, you remember the story where Samuel keeps getting awakened, whatever, and I'm a researcher, not a grammarian. He wakes up several times at night, and it's the voice of the Lord telling him, like, Samuel, Samuel, and he keeps thinking it's Eli, and Eli gives him this powerful piece of advice that even though Eli is a wicked old dude, he says what? Samuel, next time you hear the voice, go back and say, what? Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. That to me is what our job is as older generation, is to say, like, hopefully we don't turn into the wicked old Eli's, right? But like it's your turn. Speak, Lord. Like when you hear that voice again, say this, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. We need these young prodigals and nomads and exiles, as hard as that is for us sometimes to say, because we think, man, you don't know how to read, you don't know how to think, you don't know you don't think theologically, and we have all these criticisms of the next generation, but like it or not, Jesus is going to use them. He did when he was on earth. He used these broken people like Matthew and Peter. It's what he does. It's how he chooses to build his church. And for you young people, it's like you have this privilege, like Samuel did, of going out and saying, okay, Lord, yes, I'm here. What is it that you want me to say? And of course, if you remember the rest of that story, God says, Eli is wicked, and I'm about to do something in Israel just because of his wickedness. And then the next morning, Eli's like, so by the way, what did God tell you? And Samuel's like, well, God ain't so happy with you. And then Eli says, it's the Lord's will, let him do what he wants. And he eats breakfast. It's like, it's the most sad story. And then right after that, Samuel takes his place and he becomes a profound prophet in the life of Israel. And that's what I think we're about to experience with the millennial generation, whether we're ready or not. And listen, we can be different than Eli. We can be a voice of reason and of humility in serving this generation as they do what God's called them to do. All right, I've spoken way too long. I get excited about this stuff. Numbers and God's purposes, not in that order. So I'll be happy to take questions, or we can have a discussion if you prefer. Yes.
So at the beginning you mentioned that a lot of people are leaving the church because I think the sentence, church doesn't answer the questions of the complex world. Like the problem is lack of complexity in the church. So you might think at the end this to show us how the church can do that. But the end was more how the church can be interactive and relational. Is that supposed to be how the church can then do what's supposed to surveillance do to the beginning right?
Okay, great question. So I think those are more connected than maybe my presentation was good in communicating. So vocation, for instance, is part of that complexity, right? So when you are a journalist or an actress or any career, there's complexity in that. And so I think having a more deeply connected theology of vocation and training young people to think about their calling allows us to deal with life's complexities in that space. Or when I say that we can't mass produce disciples, it's not only more relational, but it's also a way that that young people can experience something of the truth of who we are as leaders. I mean, let's be honest. Part of the reason that we are struggling, and I don't know the solution to this, so I'm just going to say it the best, clearest way that I can, is that most of our efforts professionally are best suited when we have a lot of people who are part of our tribe, our church, our school, our reading our books, right? So being successful as an author, as a pastor, Nate, as a college admissions professional, as a professor. I mean, the more students you have, the more you get paid, the more status you have, the more people who read your books, the more important you are. That's just the way of life. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But here's what happens. Jesus didn't try to mass produce disciples. He spent 3 years and he invested in 12 relationships. And part of what's happening now is that we've got all these infrastructures, and like we've got mortgage payments and overhead and healthcare costs and, you know, like toys to buy our children and vacations to plan. And those aren't inherently evil. It's just that the problem is that most of our structures now are more like we're trying to mass produce people. And so when I say that we have to be really careful about this, it means we maybe need more bivocational ministry. Like we need more people who are really good at ministry, but who also can get a paycheck from from other sources, so that we're not depending on them to be really good at communicating to get a lot of people into the building in order for them to make enough money to support a family. They need to support a family. They're gifted at communicating, but they also have their other gifts. I think the Mormon church, to be honest, has probably a better model for this than most of us in the evangelical world. They don't have really paid clergy in the way that we have. They're incredibly generous. They have a lot of very responsible lay positions, but these are people who are bivocational. They are earning a living in their fields of industry. And that to me is a much closer approximation to where we need to be as a Christian church in America today. We can't be so dependent on having successful ministries support these infrastructures and because we're responsible for the souls. I did this talk in Portland, almost exactly like this right before Christmas. And a young guy from Youth for Christ, maybe 35-year-old or whatever, he's like, yeah, but you know, it's so much easier for me. When I raise funds, I got to talk about the number of lives I'm going to impact. And we have like this ROI approach to like when we invest in a ministry, you want so many saved souls. I mean, I just don't want to be in heaven when God says, okay, so really the best idea you had was just to raise X number of dollars, and you like created like an equation that says you're going to get this many like conversions for this many dollars. And we kind of do that. We literally do that in the church. So I'm sort of preaching, but anyway, that's what I'm saying. Like we got to work really hard to create new approaches to doing this. And I think innovative leaders are going to figure that out. And frankly, they're going to be pushed to do it because people are. I bet you we won't have the sort of tax credits. Americans are going to have, tougher times economically in 10 years from now. I mean, like it's going to be harder than ever just to have huge, thriving, financially viable ministries and churches. And it's going to push us to think more creatively about ministry. It really will. Sorry for that long-winded answer, but I hope you hear my passion for us to like really invest in people. Like if Jesus was here, like would he build a mega church? Is that what he would think would be his best use of time, or would he just spend time with 12 guys again? Like that's the kind of question I think we ought to be wrestling with. All right. I'll try not to be so soapboxy next time. Yes.
We're lost in culture in the church. I think a lot of these people, we still do it. These people still do it, and yet there's a frustration. There's a certain disengagement that's already there. Maybe people at my age are less likely to go away because of some of the other implications that come with it, maybe tradition and so on. But I wonder if the world views from one category of age to the next, if they're all that different. You talk about a certain age group. They're not the only ones doing that technology.
No, of course not.
I'm living in that same
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
You
Yeah.
Or trying to go with that? What would the data, has anybody done any data on the next age group, the next 20 years?
So I think there's two ways to answer that. Number one, absolutely, we're all immersed in this environment. Boomers, elders, Gen Xers like me, millennials, we're all in that environment, so we're all more likely to live in Babylon. It's just more super concentrated for this younger generation. And this is where the metaphor kind of breaks down, like we're not literally transplanted from one place to the other. But I think some of us have, so that's the first way to answer it. Yes, we're all involved in that. The other, though, is to say that to whatever extent, and I didn't hear this in your question, but I get a lot of questions from people. It's like, well, this is just sort of this. It's like the same classic question, which is like, well, every generation, what would boomers have looked like 30, 40 years ago? And I mean, I just showed you some of that data where we talk about the fact they're launching much earlier. I didn't show you this data, but look at this in terms of having children outside of wedlock. The denominational perceptions among boomers are like twice as likely to have favorable perceptions of Baptists and Assemblies of God and all the rest. And it's almost like, it's like our faith has this sort of brand component. And if I were a brand manager for being like Southern Baptist or Catholic, today's millennials have such a poor image of most of these forms of faith that, but not necessarily of Jesus and even of Christianity, they have a slightly more positive view, but some of these denominations. So I'm saying that to say there are actual reasons why the phrase, it's not your father's Oldsmobile, matters in brand marketing, because Oldsmobile is not a brand that millennials aspire to. And yet my parents and grandparents don't have like a negative view of Oldsmobile. There really is social change, and there really is changes in the way people interact with these brands. So yes, we're all in Babylon, but we also have to be really careful not to say, well, this is just the same movie we've already seen. More questions?
unChristian was published what year?
2007.
Okay, so it's not far enough out that we'd be able to maybe get some data from those folks as to what they think about the church today?
No, we hope to do a 10-year, so, in 3 or 4 years we'll start thinking about that. But, it takes a while for social change to take shape.
You said that,
No, go ahead.
you said nomads, like, it was not a bad, exile.
Yeah.
Thing. Can it also be a good thing? I mean, I know
Absolutely.
psychology and all the studies, you almost have to get that point to like really make your faith your own.
Mm.
And is that kind of what the exile, if it's handled properly, the answer, the questions are answered, right?
Yeah,
Would you say it's better than never doing that exile period?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's not only just not a negative, it's very positive for them. And I think that's the way God designed it, is he wants, we're not going to be leeching off our parents' faith for our whole life. So we have to come to our own conclusions about that. And being in Babylon means that the culture is even more antithetical to, it's more adversarial with being a faithful Christian. Nate?
One of your first slides was included younger kids. I don't remember the exact slide that it involved. Junior high, senior high, here. And it was interesting to me, the number of junior high, senior high, 19%, 27%. And I'm now 41. When I was a youth pastor a decade ago, there was kind of the height of big youth ministries across the country, and churches had invested a lot of money in salaries for youth ministers and that kind of thing. In the last decade, there's been a push against that trend-wise, where there's less emphasis on youth ministry, more on Sundays,
Mm-hmm.
more on it's all about the house. So there are phrases like that in many churches. And I'm wondering if that percentage there reflects the shift away what do you run into there?
Well, some of what you're asking I just don't know, but I do think that youth ministry needs to be reimagined. And that basically, did you ever see the movie Waiting for Superman? Which makes the argument basically that public education is now mostly about serving teachers and teachers' unions as opposed to serving the kids, right? Like that's the point. That's the editorial point. And I would make something very similar to that even though there are some, and I think there's a lot of parallels, there's a lot of teachers, individual teachers who are very passionate about educating those students, and they do a fabulous job. And many of us owe our love of learning to guys like Jesse Parker, my high school history teacher, he was awesome. So there are tons of examples of exceptions. And no one gets into youth ministry because they think it's going to be like an easy, cush job. Like that's not the case either. So again, it breaks down. But what happens is that almost like teachers' unions, we have this idea of this sort of like mixed motives for our youth pastors, where we try to like incentivize them based on the number of kids they get and how happy the parents are. And we hire them because we need a good, strong youth program. And so unfortunately, a lot of our youth programs are really there not so much for the benefit of the children and the youth, they're there for the benefit of the church, which needs some sort of extended program for what happens when our kids are no longer in the children's ministry. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to rethink how we structure youth ministry, incentivize youth ministry, partner across youth ministries. I mean, what if we just a simple idea of having 5 churches, and each church, one was like the center for young creatives, one was the center for young artists and filmmakers. I don't know what the difference is between those two, but you can fill in the blanks. The third was like Center for Young Science-Minded Students. One was about computer design and web programming. Third was about business and marketing. And we kind of quickly like identified, I mean, not like job placement, but we was like, man, you're really good at worship, or you're really good at this technical stuff. You should go over to, for First Pres, because that youth pastor, and like we'll just send you over there on Wednesdays, and like it's like a rotation, and like we're really wanting to help you figure out how does faith fit into this, and we're going to give you like free training and all the rest. I mean, what young person wouldn't love that? Finding a purpose. But that means that some churches are going to have to partner together to find the resources and bring in, the expertise to do that. And you could have like some Christian school educators and public school educators and college professors, come once a month and just sort of like teach. I mean, like those are going to be really cool programs, but it takes a vision for youth ministry that's bigger than how do I build my church with this? And that's the courage that's really, really necessary today.
What would you say to, I guess, the millennials who find themselves in that gap between church and culture, who maybe are serving somewhere, serving the older generation, and they can clearly see the gap that's being created? What would the advice be in that situation, to somebody in that situation?
Well, first of all, there's a fabulous book called A Tale of Three Kings that I think every sort of mid-level, youngish leaders need to read about, like leadership transitions, because God either calls you to work for those institutions that often feel like you see the gap, but you feel like you can't change it, so you feel frustrated. But he also sometimes asks people to leave and go start their own things, or go and do it. Like you see the gap, so go fill it. And so that just gets back to what God's calling you to. I'm saying this like it's you, and maybe that was an autobiographical question or not, but like I think that's where you've got to either serve that institution and say, I'm here, God's got me here, I'm going to be a change agent and point out the things that I see, or there comes a point where it's like, no, it's really time for me to leave. And when it's time for you to leave, it's like, go and leave well, and go do that thing, or go to another organization where you can contribute in a more meaningful way to the gap that you sense that there is. And that's a really tough place to be, where you're mid-20s, mid-30s, it's like you're sort of stuck somewhere in this sort of netherworld between having the power to make the change and then seeing the things that need to be changed. I mean, I bought the Barna Group from George 3.5 years ago, and I mean, I was in that place for a while, like, okay, I see things we could do differently, and I think we should do them, but I didn't have the budget and the authority to do them. But now I'm owner and I'm doing the things I want to do, and I'm like, oh, that's why George did it that way. I get it. So it's interesting the things that you do learn. I don't know, did I answer your question? Okay, cool. Yeah.
Within your research experience, seeing that we're measuring success of youth ministry or churches or whatever by numbers and how many people they brought in and how much they raised, whatever. Is there a better way that you guys have found to quantify spiritual growth? Or is it working that like there hasn't been anything else now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I showed some of this here. I'll get to it here. Partly for that reason, that I think the stuff on the right there is a better type of thing to measure than the first side. But it's not that we shouldn't count the side on the left either. Those things can be very important as well. And listen, it's harder to measure attitudes than it is attendance. But it's not impossible. And sometimes, we have to, I think, do a little bit harder work in looking at that. And again, this is where a lot of our financial models are we need some really creative thinking about this. I know of an organization that is thinking about insurance, and insurance is changing a lot because you have, insurance salespeople, but what is an insurance salesperson? When I say insurance salesperson, do you have a positive or negative association with that? Anybody have a positive? Neutral? Neutral? Okay, but mostly negative, right? Well, part of the reason is because they see you as a target, kind of like we do as Christians. Okay, well, I want you for my church. It's like the old picture of Uncle Sam. I want you for the U.S. military. So an insurance agent comes at this with that kind of approach. Well, what if this organization that we've been working with, we've been encouraging them to think of it as enlisting financial missionaries, and no one is incentivized based on sales. It's all based on I'm going to ask you, just like a missionary would ask you for support. I would like you to consider supporting me for $50 a month. Missionaries do this all over the world, so this is not a new concept. But we need people that could actually go out and help millennials and other families figure out finances and insurance, because there's actually some huge risks that we're taking as families not to do. Well, so that to me feels like we need those kinds of ideas about youth ministry, because a lot of youth ministers, again, they're well-meaning and good guys and gals, but we've kind of set it up to where, okay, I want you for my youth group. I want you to come on Wednesday nights because I'm going to give a great talk. And that's not, of course, why we got into youth ministry. We want to see these young people's lives transformed, but that's the best idea we have right now of trying to engage these young people. So we need some new ideas. I don't have a bunch of them. I'm just a researcher. We're trying to find more, and we're going to be doing some more studying on that. But we need leaders. We need people to come along. When I talked about going to figure out the Mormon model, we need people who are courageous enough to go to the Mormon wards in their communities and sit down and we're not trying to, this is not a battle about the golden plates and Joseph Smith and the angel Moroni. All we're doing is just show us how you guys do this. How is it that you have so much lay involvement? How is it that how is it that Mormons are so successful in so many of their vocations and have such really good families? Is it possible that we can learn from people with whom we disagree, and that we would debate as to whether they're even Christians? And could we sit in the room with difference and say, we as an evangelical church have a lot of learning to do, and maybe we don't take everything you have, but is it possible that we can learn from them? Why not? They seem to be doing some good stuff in the world. So that's an example of where we might go looking even at the Mormons for how it is that they have such an engaging way that they enroll young people. They talk about vocation. They talk about mission. They talk about literally going on a mission. They find financial support for those missionaries. Those are really, really critical aspects, I think, of that, and we have a chance to learn from them. What time did you say you guys wanted to wrap this up? I'm happy to answer questions till this evening or tomorrow morning, but I also want to be sensitive to you all. So it's 4:18. Okay. Okay, great. Well, let's go. I mean, I'm happy to keep answering questions. I just want to be sensitive because I know you all have things you got to do. So let me also say, if you need to get going, you can go now, but we'll take maybe just a couple more questions. Yeah.
So when you do the research on this side, what people are leaving, you start with things like the complexity question and the different things that are supposedly problematic. Do you have any research on the other side that shows that churches who are doing those sorts of things are actually seeing more success?
Well, the next project that we're trying to look at is really more like what is working with millennials. So the short answer is we're going to go out and do that. I'm always a little reluctant. I'm even still a bit conflicted about how to do that study because I don't want to simply say, man, check out X church, because then everyone thinks, well, they're not that great, or they go flock to them, and then it turns out the youth pastor has a moral failure or whatever it is, and then we look silly for pointing to them. And a lot of people who aren't leaders, they try to copycat what they did, but they've missed the spirit of it, and they just end up making a lame excuse for Willow Creek or they try to do it, but it just never turns out as good. So, and I'm big on each of us have a calling. We don't have to try to be like somebody else. We can learn from others, but that's different than just copycatting someone else's ministry. So we're setting out to learn a lot of that. And I mean, I think, you made a sort of an interesting comment there, and it might have just been the way you put it, but you sort of said, the complexity and supposedly the way this is working out for them. I mean, I would die to defend this research. I mean, it's the complexity of the culture. When I interview people and see the kind of challenges that they're facing, this is the reason we're losing them. And so when we talk about having a better relationship with young people, I mean, one thing we have seen clearly from the research is that you have an adult relationship with someone other than your parent or the youth pastor, you have almost a twice as likely chance of staying with your faith in your 20s. And so only 3 in 10 young people in our churches have an adult friend at the church. So I mean, that's an immediate thing that you could go out and measure really simply by going out and saying to youth pastors or to the youth, who is your best friend here? Do you have one? And that would be a simple way. And so the reason that helps with complexity isn't just because maybe that person happens to be smart and could give a good apologetic for science versus faith. It's that all of a sudden they begin to care about that person. And they begin, so with our daughter Emily, we know that our faith is the most important factor. But we've been really grateful that she's beginning to connect with Ava, one of the adult sponsors, one of the mentors that she has in the group. And as Emily faces questions of does Jesus matter in my life? And we all face those questions. Our adversary makes sure that we do. She has somebody else who could say, yeah, I've really struggled with that. But I've come to this conviction about Jesus. So that's what I mean about complexity. Or as Emily gets involved in whatever career she has, that she has people around her who can help say, no, this Christian thing actually doesn't matter. And here's a book you could read. Or here's a website you could visit. So that's what I mean in terms of dealing with complexity through relationships.
And when I say supposedly, and I don't even remember saying it, so that wasn't that intentional of a word choice, but it wasn't that's not the reason that they're citing for the research is what it is. But sometimes people say something, but if we then start providing them complex, satisfying answers, maybe that really doesn't.
It's true.
Holding them there. So that's why I was curious if
Yeah.
there's on the other side. And I think the explanation you gave, research about having another relationship, that doesn't necessarily mean they're getting the complex answers,
That's right.
but that's something.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Yes.
Looking at trends in student ministry over the past couple of decades, where do you see some of those trends going in this upcoming decade, just in terms of, models of student ministry? Is it more small group based where they don't even meet on a Wednesday night, or that typical, midweek service? What types of trends do you see coming up in the upcoming decade or two?
Well, it's hard to know even more than 5 years out. So I'll say that, things do change substantially enough, quickly enough. But I mean, I think this idea of vocation, I mean, I hear so many people talking about that now, about, faith and vocation. I think there'll be a lot more necessity for it. I mean, to me, it's if we're going to have youth ministry in exile, we have to talk about vocation, what you're called to do. So think about that young person who said, you have no idea what it did to my faith when I was named one of the top fashion experts in the world. So back that train up a bit to when he's 3, 4, 5 years younger, and someone did talk to him about, hey, what would happen? I mean, you love fashion and style and, like the world of whatever that involves. And are you ready when someone comes and says, I mean, like someone identifies you as an expert? Are you prepared for these kinds of questions? So I think those kinds of theological approaches to questions of fame and celebrity, of economics, how do we deal with our economic situations? This is a generation that's more indebted than ever. And part of the reason they're getting married later is that they are more indebted. It's harder to get married when you have $40,000 of school debt and $30,000 of consumer debt or whatever, So we have to help them earlier before they get into those challenging situations, to think about their financial choices and the consequences that's going to have. We have to talk theologically about the way we're stewarding our time with technology. That technology, we talk about stewardship as time, treasure, and talent. And so the fourth T is technology. It's affecting how we use our time and our treasure and our talent. And so we need to give them a good theology of how technology is affecting their time and their talent and their treasure. I mean, just think about the fact that, it's sort of like a no-brainer for young people to spend money on a data plan with a cell phone company. And maybe that's just a part of life, but I mean, that's thousands of dollars for most young people. And that's taking, I mean, any insurance agent will tell you, if you invested $1,000 when you're 20, it's worth a lot more than when you invest $1,000 when you're 40 or 60, right? Because it's earlier in your life and it can compound. So that's another reason, like, we need to help them understand stewardship at an earlier age. Issues of sexuality is another area that I think we have to be willing to address. To me, the form, like small groups versus Wednesday nights versus, I don't pay as much attention to that as a trend watcher, because it doesn't, to me, it's more about the content and the shape and the substance and the way we're thinking about cultivating, intergenerational relationships. I mean, like I said, it's as simple as, if we knew that having an adult relationship would make you a stronger Christian, and we knew that 7 out of 10 of our young people didn't have a best friend who was an adult, except for the youth pastor. And by the way, you're not hiring a youth pastor to be best friends with I hope you're not, right? And I hope you're making that clear to those youth pastors. So I think those are the kinds of things we'll see. I think youth pastors are going to have to face this question of, are we really transforming lives, or are we just sort of a great extracurricular activity that's an augment to the church's services and programs? So, all right, those are a few of my ideas. Thank you so much for hanging in, and I wish we had like a little bit, this is a beautiful room and it's impressive. I also wish we had like kind of a round table today, because I don't feel like, I know some things about our research and I'm an expert in that way, but like, like the Lord be with you in the work that you're doing and the studies that you guys are doing, because it really does matter. And, the leadership that we bring to these things, Nate, I think about, you and your new work, and, like the choices that you make based on, maybe something the Holy Spirit inspired today as a leader could be huge, right? Like the kind of youth ministry you would build. And ultimately, there's this really fascinating book called The Coming Jobs War. And I wouldn't recommend it. It's fine. I'm not trying to tell you to go get it. But he says this, he makes this argument that if we had a nation of Detroits, we'd be a far less financially viable country, because Detroit has been through some hard economic times, right? He said, instead, we have a place, like if we were a nation full of San Franciscos, we would be we'd be even richer than we are. And he's like the power of cities, like that's so important for our economic thriving. Well, in a similar way, like the choices you make, and I'm not picking on you, we've come to know each other just a bit today and last night. Like the choices you make are going to represent like the cumulative choices all of us make. If we made that choice at every church we're a part of, is going to have a commitment to having great friendships between older generations and younger generations, like that's the least of what it means to be the body of Christ, is to have friendships that matter between generations. And instead, we succumb so often to the sin between generations, like young versus old, that generational warfare. It's a sin problem, just like we so often have ethnic divisions or gender divisions. It's a sin issue. So I think generational stuff is like a sin issue at its core. But if instead we could be the kind of church where the sin of being the intergenerational sort of warfare that happens was put aside, and we had more churches that were like San Francisco in terms of the city, like it's a thriving church, and it's got thriving youth, and it's got thriving programs. If you think about that sort of like a cumulative effect, that's what makes a difference socially. If 100,000 churches in America over the next 2 years made a decision to do youth ministry differently, and we could produce different kinds of results, that would make a huge difference in the kind of output. That's a huge vision, right? But that can be accomplished if we make better choices as leaders. That's what being a leader is all about. So you all are leaders in the places that God's put you. Go and lead. Do make wise choices with what God's giving us to deal with. Just a little encouragement. Thank you.